This isn't about action, this is about restraint. In a crowded courtyard, a royal guard faces a murderer with a loaded weapon. What follows is a masterclass in calm under fire. From silent tension to a life-or-death standoff, this story unfolds. In moments that test everything: training, judgment, and strength. If you believe true power lies in discipline, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The morning of June 14th started like any other at Buckingham Palace. The sun cast long shadows across the pristine courtyard as Lance Corporal Nathan Harwood took his position at the main entrance. His scarlet tunic pressed to perfection, his bearskin hat sitting precisely as regulation demanded. Nathan had been a royal guard for 3 years, and in that time, he had mastered the art of becoming a living statue. But 20 miles away, in a cramped bedsit in East London, Daniel Mercer was loading bullets into a 9mm pistol with hands that hadn't stopped shaking in weeks. The newspapers scattered across his filthy mattress told a story of escalating violence. 3 murders in 2 months, each one more brutal than the last. The headlines screamed his name, called him a monster, a psychopath. But to Daniel, he was just a man pushed too far by a system that had abandoned him. Nathan's morning routine was methodical: a light breakfast, physical training, equipment inspection, and then the ceremonial preparation that transformed him from man to symbol. Each button polished, each kris sharp enough to cut paper. His rifle, though loaded with blanks for ceremony, was maintained with the precision of a weapon that might need to save lives. He had no idea that today it would. Meanwhile, Daniel was studying photographs he'd taken over the past month. Close-ups of the guards, their positions, their rotation, schedules. He'd noticed something about the one with the piercing blue eyes, Lance Corporal Harwood, according to the duty roster he'd memorized. This guard never flinched, never showed emotion, never acknowledged the world around him. Daniel found this inhuman stillness infuriating. Today, he would shatter it. The first tourists began arriving as the palace gates opened. Families with children, elderly couples clutching guidebooks, teenagers taking selfies, all of them drawn to witness the spectacle of the guards. These men who stood like monuments to British tradition. None of them noticed the thin, agitated man in the oversized jacket who kept checking his watch and muttering under his breath. Nathan had been in position for an hour when he first spotted him. Something about the man's movement pattern was wrong. Too purposeful, too focused. While other tourists wandered aimlessly, snapping photos and chattering excitedly, this one moved with intent. Nathan's training kicked in subtly, his awareness heightened without any outward change in his statuesque posture. Daniel had chosen this day carefully. The weather was perfect, ensuring maximum crowds. More witnesses meant more chaos, more panic, more opportunity to make his statement. He'd spent months planning this moment, ever since the system had failed him for the last time. Evicted from his flat, denied benefits, ignored by social services, society had made him invisible, and now he would force them to see him. The psychological pressure of maintaining perfect stillness for hours was something Nathan had learned to embrace rather than endure. In Afghanistan, during his deployment with the Welsh Guards, he'd discovered that true discipline wasn't about suppressing human nature, it was about channeling it. Every itch ignored, every distraction dismissed, made him stronger. Today, that strength would be tested like never before. As Daniel circled the courtyard for the 3rd time, he studied the other guards, the police presence, the sightlines, but his eyes always returned to Nathan. There was something about that guard's absolute stillness that felt like a personal challenge. In Daniel's fractured mind, that unwavering discipline represented everything he'd been denied: control, respect, purpose. The crowd was thickening now. A Japanese tour group clustered around the gates, their guide explaining the history of the changing of the guard ceremony. American tourists debated the best angles for photographs. Children pressed their faces against the railings, trying to make the guards smile or blink. The noise level rose steadily. Laughter, conversation, the clicking of camera shutters. Through it all, Nathan remained perfectly still, but his mind was cataloging everything. The placement of civilians, potential escape routes, the location of his fellow guards, and the Ministry of Defense police. He'd learned in the military that situational awareness didn't require movement. Sometimes the best vantage point was absolute stillness, allowing the world to move around you while you observed and assessed. Daniel's plan was simple in its brutality. Walk up to the guard, put the gun to his head, and pull the trigger. The shock would create chaos, and in that chaos, he could disappear into the crowd or die trying. Either outcome felt preferable to his current existence as a hunted man with nowhere left to run. But as he approached Nathan's position, doubt began to creep in. The guard's presence was more intimidating up close. Standing at attention, Nathan seemed to tower over the crowd, his bearing radiating a quiet authority that made people instinctively give him space. Even the boldest tourists who tried to pose next to him for photos seemed to maintain a respectful distance. Nathan's peripheral vision caught movement, the same agitated man from earlier, now moving with more purpose. Something metallic glinted briefly under the man's jacket. Nathan's heart rate increased slightly, but his breathing remained controlled, his posture unchanged. His training had taught him that panic was the enemy of clear thinking, and clear thinking was what saved lives. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel as he closed the distance. Here he was, about to murder a man whose job was to protect the very institution that had failed them both. The royal family, the government, the entire system that crushed people like him, while propping up symbols like the guards. But the guard himself was just another victim, wasn't he? Another man ground up by the machine. A small child, maybe 5 years old, broke free from her mother's grip and ran toward Nathan. She stopped just out of arm's reach and stared up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Mummy, why won't he look at me?" she asked loudly enough for the crowd to hear. Scattered laughter rippled through the tourists. Nathan felt the child's presence like a weight on his consciousness, but his gaze remained fixed straight ahead. Daniel was close enough now to smell the polish on Nathan's boots, to see the individual threads in his uniform, close enough to see that this wasn't just a statue. This was a man, probably not much older than himself. A man with a family, dreams, fears. The realization should have stopped him, but instead, it fueled his rage. Why did this man get to matter when Daniel didn't? The little girl was still staring at Nathan when Daniel's hand slipped into his jacket and found the grip of the pistol. The metal was warm from being pressed against his body, and the weight of it felt both reassuring and terrifying. This was it, the point of no return. Nathan's enhanced peripheral vision caught the movement immediately. The man's shoulder had shifted, his right arm angled in a way that suggested he was reaching for something. The positioning, the body language, the focused intensity. Nathan's combat experience screamed danger, but he couldn't see the weapon yet, couldn't be certain of the threat level. A group of German tourists had positioned themselves nearby, their guide explaining the significance of the bearskin hats. An elderly American couple was arguing about the best spot for a photograph. 2 teenagers were filming themselves trying to make the guard laugh, all of them completely oblivious to the violence brewing just feet away. Daniel's breathing had become shallow and rapid. His vision tunneled until all he could see was Nathan's profile, the soft spot just below the ear where the bullet would enter. He'd killed 3 people in the past 2 months, but they'd all been in private, quick, brutal encounters in alleyways and empty flats. This would be different. This would be public, witnessed, remembered. The weapon cleared the jacket slowly, Daniel's movements deliberately controlled to avoid drawing attention. The crowd's attention was scattered, some watching Nathan, others taking photos of the palace facade, children running between their parents' legs. No one was watching the thin man in the oversized jacket as he raised a loaded pistol toward a royal guard's head. Nathan saw it from the corner of his eye, the distinctive silhouette of a handgun emerging from concealment. Time seemed to slow. As his mind processed the threat, calculated angles, assessed civilian positions, his right hand was mere inches from his own weapon, his training screaming at him to draw and engage. But the crowd was too dense, too chaotic. A firefight here would be a massacre. The moment Daniel Mercer raised the pistol and pointed it directly at Lance Corporal Nathan Harwood's head, everything changed. The weapon was now visible to anyone who looked in their direction, but the crowd's attention was scattered. A tourist nearby noticed first, a middle-aged woman who opened her mouth to scream, but found herself frozen by the surreal nature of what she was seeing. Nathan felt the presence of the gun like a physical weight against his temple, though it was still 3 feet away. His military training had prepared him for this moment in 1,000 different scenarios, but none of them had involved protecting dozens of innocent civilians while maintaining the dignity of his ceremonial post. His finger wanted to curl around, his trigger, but his mind ran rapid calculations of trajectory and collateral damage. Daniel's voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper at first. "Look at me," he hissed, spittle forming at the corners of his mouth. "Look at me." The second demand was louder, causing several nearby tourists to turn in their direction. A child pointed at the gun and tugged on his father's sleeve. The realization began to spread through the crowd like ripples in a pond. The psychological warfare was intentional. Daniel had studied enough about military training to know that discipline was built on routine and predictability. By forcing Nathan to choose between his ceremonial duty and survival instinct, he was trying to shatter the man's composure. But what Daniel didn't understand was that Nathan's stillness wasn't robotic obedience, it was tactical patience. A woman screamed, then another. The crowd began to notice the weapon, and panic started to build. People grabbed their children, started backing away, fumbling for their phones to call for help or record the unfolding drama. But they were in an enclosed courtyard, with limited exits, and crowd dynamics meant that panic could quickly become deadly. Nathan's peripheral vision tracked the growing chaos, while his central focus remained fixed ahead. He could see Ministry of Defense police officers beginning to move through the crowd, their body language shifting from casual surveillance to active response. But they were at least 30 seconds away, maybe more if they had to push through panicking civilians. The gun was now clearly visible to dozens of people, and the word was spreading fast. "Gun. He's got a gun." The panic was infectious, but constrained by the confined space and the crowd density. People wanted to run but had nowhere to go. Children were crying, adults were shouting, cameras were filming everything. Daniel felt a surge of power as he watched the chaos spread. This was what he'd wanted to matter, to be impossible to ignore, to force the world to acknowledge his existence. The gun gave him that power, and pointing it at the guard's head gave him the ultimate leverage. "3 people are dead because of men like you," he said, his voice now loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Serving a system that doesn't give a damn about people like me." Nathan understood now that this wasn't random violence. This was a broken man making a statement. The knowledge didn't make the situation less dangerous, but it gave him insight into the shooter's mindset. Men who killed for ideology were different from men who killed for pleasure or profit. They could sometimes be reasoned with, but they were also more likely to die for their cause. The closest mod police officer was now 20 meters away, but his path was blocked by terrified tourists. He was speaking urgently into his radio while trying to navigate through the crowd without causing a stampede. Other officers were converging from different directions, but they all faced the same problem: how to respond to an armed threat. In a crowd of innocent civilians, a news crew that had been filming a routine piece about summer tourism suddenly found themselves documenting a potential murder. Their camera operator, acting on pure instinct, zoomed in on Nathan's face, capturing the absolute stillness that had become his trademark. Viewers would later describe the image as haunting, a man staring death in the face without blinking. Daniel's rage was building now, fed by Nathan's continued silence. "Say something," he screamed. "Beg for your life. Show me you're human." But Nathan remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed straight ahead. To the crowd, it looked like incredible discipline. To Daniel, it felt like the ultimate insult. Even with a gun to his head, this guard refused to acknowledge him. The standoff had been going on for less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. Daniel's hand was beginning to shake from adrenaline, and the weight of holding the weapon extended. Sweat ran down his face despite the cool morning air. The crowd had formed a rough circle around them, everyone wanting to be far enough away to be safe, but close enough to witness history. Nathan could sense the shooter's growing agitation through subtle changes in his breathing and posture. This was the most dangerous phase, when adrenaline began to override rational thought, when the gap between intention and action narrowed to nothing. But Nathan also sensed something else: uncertainty. The shooter had expected fear, pleading, some kind of human reaction. The absolute stillness was not part of his script. The little girl who had been staring at Nathan earlier was now crying in her mother's arms about 10 meters away. Her sobs cut through the tension like a knife, reminding everyone present that this wasn't a movie or a video game. Real lives were at stake. The sound seemed to affect Daniel too, his expression flickering between rage and something that might have been regret. An mod officer had finally gotten close enough to have a clear shot, but the angle was wrong. Daniel was positioned so that Nathan's body would be in the line of fire, and beyond them both were more civilians. The officer spoke into his radio again, requesting specialist armed response units. But everyone knew they were minutes away at best. Daniel's voice cracked. As he spoke again, "I've got nothing left to lose. Do you understand that? Nothing. You stand there in your fancy uniform, protecting people who wouldn't piss on me if I was on fire. What's the point of your life compared to mine?" The philosophical question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Nathan's training had included psychological profiling of potential threats. This man wasn't a terrorist or a professional killer. He was desperate, probably mentally ill, certainly dangerous. The combination of personal grievance and public spectacle meant he was likely to follow through on his threat, unless something fundamental changed in the dynamic. A shift in the crowd's energy suggested that word was spreading beyond the immediate area. More police were arriving, but they were setting up a perimeter rather than closing in. Someone had made the tactical decision to contain the situation rather than escalate it. Through his peripheral vision, Nathan could see snipers taking positions on nearby buildings. Daniel noticed the increased police presence too, and it seemed to focus his resolve, rather than deterrent it. "Look around," he shouted to the crowd. "Look how many of them it takes to protect one man. Where were they when I needed protection? When I was sleeping rough? When I was begging for help?" His personal manifesto was spilling out now. Years of frustration and alienation pouring through the barrel of a gun. The news crew had been joined by others, and the incident was now being broadcast live. Millions of people were watching Nathan. How would stand perfectly still while a wanted murderer held a gun to his head? Social media was exploding with speculation, praise, criticism, and amateur psychological analysis. The guard's name was trending worldwide. Nathan was acutely aware that his response in the next few minutes would be studied and analyzed for years to come. But more immediately, he knew that dozens of lives hung in the balance. The crowd was getting restless, people were getting trampled in the press to get away, and the shooter was becoming more agitated by the second. A senior police officer with a megaphone had taken position about 50 meters away. "Daniel Mercer," his voice boomed across the courtyard. "We know who you are. We know what you've been through. Let's talk about this." The negotiation had begun, but Daniel's attention remained fixed on Nathan. This was personal now, a battle of wills between two men who represented everything that each other despised. The weapon's barrel was close enough to Nathan's head that he could feel the heat radiating from it. Daniel had fired it recently, probably that morning, possibly at his previous victim. The smell of gunpowder was faint but unmistakable. Nathan's own weapon remained holstered, his hands at his sides, his breathing controlled and steady. The negotiator continued trying to establish dialogue with Daniel, but the killer's focus remained intensely personal. "You want to know why I killed those 3 people?" Daniel addressed Nathan directly, as if they were alone together instead of surrounded by hundreds of witnesses. "Because they were symbols, just like you. A banker who foreclosed on homes, a social worker who cut benefits, a politician who voted to cut mental health funding. All of them part of the machine that creates people like me." Nathan understood. Now that he wasn't just a target, he was the climax of Daniel's killing spree. The final statement in a manifesto written in blood. The realization brought both clarity and additional pressure. This man had already committed multiple murders. He wouldn't hesitate to kill again, but he was also seeking meaning in his violence, which meant he could potentially be reached through reason. The crowd had quieted somewhat. Many people straining to hear the conversation between killer and guard children had been moved further back, but their parents remained, transfixed by the unfolding drama. Smartphones recorded everything from dozens of angles, creating a comprehensive digital record of what might be Nathan's final moments. Daniel's weapon hand was trembling more noticeably now, the adrenaline and emotion taking their toll. "Say something," he screamed again. "Fight back. Show some human emotion." But Nathan remained as still as marble, his gaze fixed on infinity, his breathing slow and controlled. The absolute discipline was becoming its own form of resistance. An armed response team had finally arrived and was taking positions around the perimeter. Their presence was professional and largely invisible to the crowd, but Nathan could sense the shift in tactical dynamics. Snipers were in position, the perimeter was secure, and specialized negotiators were en route. The situation was contained, but it remained volatile. The strangest aspect of the standoff was how it had become almost intimate, despite the public setting. Daniel was close enough to Nathan to smell his aftershave, to see the individual whiskers on his freshly shaved jaw. The physical proximity created a bizarre sense of connection between two men who couldn't have been more different in their life choices and values. Time seemed suspended as Daniel wrestled with his final decision. The gun remained trained on Nathan's head, his finger on the trigger, but something had changed in his demeanor. The guard's absolute refusal to engage, to show fear, to validate. Daniel's need for recognition was having an unexpected effect. Instead of rage, confusion was creeping in. "I don't understand you," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant sound of sirens and helicopter rotors. "How can you just stand there? Don't you want to live?" It was the first time he'd spoken to Nathan as a person rather than a symbol, and the change in tone was noticed by everyone within hearing range. Nathan felt the question as a physical weight. Of course he wanted to live. He wanted to see his family again, to continue his service, to grow old and tell stories about his time as a royal guard, but he also understood that his role in this moment was larger than his personal desires. He was the calm center in a storm of violence and chaos, and maintaining that calm might be the only thing preventing a massacre. The negotiator had been gradually moving closer, and his voice now carried clearly across the courtyard. "Daniel, I can see you're in pain. We all can. But this isn't the way to make people understand. That guard you're threatening, he's just doing his job. He's not your enemy." The words were carefully chosen, designed to redirect Daniel's anger away from Nathan and toward the system he truly blamed. But Daniel was beyond reason now, caught between his desire for violence and his growing confusion about Nathan's behavior. The guard's stillness had become a mirror, reflecting back Daniel's own emptiness and isolation. In trying to break Nathan's discipline, he had confronted his own lack of purpose and control. The final moment came suddenly. Daniel's hand began to lower, not in surrender but in exhaustion. The weight of the weapon, the adrenaline crash, and the psychological pressure of Nathan's unwavering composure had combined to break his resolve. As the gun moved away from Nathan's head, 3 sharp cracks echoed across the courtyard. The police snipers had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, the moment when Daniel's weapon was no longer directly threatening Nathan or the crowd. The shots were precise and final, dropping Daniel instantly. As his body hit the ground, Nathan remained perfectly still, his gaze never wavering, his composure intact, even as blood splattered across his scarlet tunic. In the aftermath, as medics pronounced Daniel Mercer dead and investigators began their work, Lance Corporal Nathan Harwood continued to stand at attention. It would be another hour before he was officially relieved of duty, and only then would he allow himself to process what had happened. His absolute discipline in the face of mortal danger had not only saved his own life, but potentially prevented a massacre in one of London's most crowded tourist destinations. The incident would be studied in military academies and police training facilities around the world. But for Nathan, it was simply another day of service, one that had tested his training, his character, and his commitment to duty in ways he had never imagined possible.